January 4th, 1945, 7:15 in the morning. The flight deck of USS Langley pitches beneath Commander Charles August's boots as he climbs into the cockpit of his F6F-5 Hellcat. The morning air over the Philippine Sea carries the smell of aviation fuel and salt spray. His mission is straightforward: escort 6 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers to Kobi airfield on Formosa, then strafe any targets of opportunity. The Japanese designation 29 painted on his tail marks him as part of VF-44, a squadron that has been hammering Japanese installations across the island for weeks. August advances the throttle, feeling the familiar thunder of the Pratt and Whitney R-2800 engine beneath him. The Hellcat rolls forward, accelerates down the deck, and lifts into the dawn sky. Within 3 hours, engine failure will force him down onto enemy territory. Within weeks, his aircraft will be in Japanese hands, transported to the Yokosuka Naval Air Technical Arsenal, where engineers will discover something that contradicts everything their pilots have been telling them about American fighters. The examination of this single captured Hellcat will expose a truth more devastating than any battlefield defeat: that Japan has been fighting a war it cannot win, not because of inferior courage or skill, but because the industrial and engineering philosophy that created the F6F represents a level of capability Japan simply cannot match. The strike package approaches Kobi airfield at altitude, August leading his division of Hellcats as planned. Below, the airfield spreads across the Formosan landscape, Japanese aircraft visible on the hardstands and in revetments. The Avengers begin their bombing runs while the Hellcat pilots prepare for their strafing passes. Then, August's engine coughs. The smooth thunder of the R-2800 stutters, loses power, then catches again briefly before dying completely. Oil pressure drops, coolant temperature spikes. Every instrument on his panel tells him the same story: catastrophic mechanical failure. He's flying a 9,000-pound glider at 8,000 feet over enemy territory. August keys his radio, transmitting his situation to the flight leader, then begins searching for somewhere, anywhere, to put the dying aircraft down. The Hellcat still has too much altitude and energy for a water ditching to be survivable. He needs level ground, and he needs it within the next 90 seconds. He spots what appears to be a field near the airfield. Not ideal, but his options are narrowing by the second. August lines up his approach, dropping flaps, lowering his landing gear. The Hellcat descends in eerie silence, the windmilling propeller the only sound as he glides toward Formosan soil. At 200 feet, he realizes the field is rougher than it appeared from altitude, but he's committed now. The main gear touches Earth at approximately 80 miles per hour. The aircraft bounces once, settles, then the nose gear catches something, a rut or hidden obstacle, and the Hellcat pitches forward violently. The propeller strikes ground, bending into useless scrap metal. The fuselage scrapes across the field in a shower of sparks and torn metal before finally sliding to a stop. August sits in the cockpit for perhaps 3 seconds, conducting the mental inventory every pilot performs after a crash landing. Everything works. No broken bones, no blood, no fire. He releases his harness, pops the canopy, and climbs out onto the wing. Japanese soldiers are already running toward him from the airfield perimeter. There's nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Within minutes, Commander Charles August becomes a prisoner of war for the second time in the conflict. In November 1942, then Lieutenant Junior Grade August had been shot down over North Africa during Operation Torch, captured by Vichy French forces, then repatriated when the Vichy capitulated. Now he faces 9 months of captivity under very different circumstances. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But August's captivity is not the story here. The aircraft he left sitting in that field near Kobi airfield, Bureau number 71441, is about to become one of the most intensely studied pieces of American technology in Japanese hands. Ground crews from Kobi airfield approached the downed Hellcat cautiously that first afternoon, half expecting booby traps or demolition charges. American pilots sometimes destroyed sensitive equipment before abandoning aircraft, and the Japanese have learned to be careful. But August had no time for such measures. The Hellcat sits there intact, its 650 caliber machine guns loaded, its ammunition boxes still holding hundreds of rounds, every system and component waiting to be examined. The initial assessment takes only minutes. The engine is damaged beyond field repair, the propeller destroyed, the landing gear twisted from the hard landing. But the airframe itself remains fundamentally sound. This isn't wreckage. This is an opportunity. For nearly 2 years, Japanese pilots have been sending back increasingly desperate reports about the Hellcat. They describe an aircraft that seems invulnerable, absorbing damage that would destroy any Japanese fighter. They report firepower that can shred a Zero with a single burst. They describe tactics that give American pilots overwhelming advantage in nearly every engagement. But pilot reports from the chaos of combat cannot provide the kind of detailed technical intelligence that changes the course of engineering programs. Here, sitting on Formosan soil, is the answer to every question Japanese aviation has been asking since August 1943, when the Hellcat first appeared in combat. The recovery operation begins immediately. Japanese ground crews work under the very real threat of American air attack to move the Hellcat to a more secure location within the airfield perimeter. They photograph every detail, document the damage, catalogue the equipment and systems. The aircraft is too valuable to leave exposed. Within days, arrangements are made to transport it to Japan. The Hellcat, registration number later assigned as Yo-801 by the Yokosuka Air Group, is carefully loaded onto a transport vessel for the journey across the East China Sea to the Japanese home islands. The voyage takes weeks, moving at night to avoid American submarines that have turned Japanese shipping lanes into killing grounds. But by late January 1945, the Hellcat arrives at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal on Tokyo Bay, one of Japan's primary aviation research and development facilities. Word spreads through Japan's aviation engineering community with electric speed. A captured Hellcat, relatively intact, ready for comprehensive examination. Engineers who have spent months trying to understand how American fighters have achieved such dominance finally have the opportunity to see for themselves. The Hellcat is moved into a secure hangar under 24-hour guard. Initial photography and documentation takes days. Every angle, every access panel, every component receives meticulous attention. The engineers know this examination might be their only chance to understand American fighter design philosophy at this level of detail. They establish systematic teams. Structures specialists will examine the airframe. Power plant experts will focus on the engine. Systems engineers will study hydraulics, fuel systems, and controls. Armament technicians will catalogue the weapons installation. It's a comprehensive intelligence effort, and everyone involved understands the stakes. The first walk-around inspection reveals an aircraft that looks fundamentally different from anything in the Japanese inventory. Where Japanese fighters pursue elegant, streamlined aesthetics with minimum weight, the Hellcat appears brutish, heavy, overbuilt. The fuselage is thicker, the wings are broader. Everything about it suggests mass rather than grace. Senior engineer Takeda, who will lead the examination, runs his hand along the wing's leading edge and feels aluminum that seems unnecessarily thick by Japanese standards. The riveting pattern shows machine precision rather than hand-fitting. Panel edges are consistent in ways Japanese aircraft rarely achieve. Even before the detailed disassembly begins, Takeda recognizes that this aircraft represents not just different design choices, but an entirely different manufacturing paradigm. The cockpit examination begins on the second day. An engineer climbs into the pilot's seat and immediately notes how cramped everything feels. The Hellcat was designed for larger American pilots, and even average-sized Japanese aviators find the space tight. But that minor discomfort becomes irrelevant as the examination progresses. Behind the seat sits a steel armor plate approximately 3/8 of an inch thick, angled to deflect rounds coming from behind and below. Additional armor protects the headrest. The windscreen incorporates armored glass thick enough to stop rifle-caliber rounds from the front. The engineers make careful measurements and calculate the total armor weight approaches 240 pounds. 240 pounds dedicated solely to protecting the pilot. This discovery sparks intense discussion among the engineering team. Japanese fighters carry no armor. Not a single plate protects the pilot from enemy fire. This design philosophy emerged from multiple factors. Weight considerations, certainly, but also a martial ethos that emphasized offensive capability over defensive protection. The assumption had been that skilled pilots wouldn't get hit, that maneuverability was the best protection, that every pound saved could be invested in performance. The engineers conduct ballistic tests using captured Japanese ammunition. They set up armor samples at combat ranges and fire 7.7mm rounds from a Type 89 machine gun. The armor stops everything, even 20mm rounds from a Type 99 cannon, while they damage the plate, fail to achieve full penetration at typical combat ranges. The test results force an uncomfortable conclusion. American pilots sit behind protection that makes them nearly invulnerable to the primary weapons Japanese fighters carry. The seat itself reveals another philosophical difference. It's robust, heavily constructed, designed to protect the pilot during violent carrier landings. Japanese seats, by comparison, are lighter, simpler, adequate for their purpose but not built to the same standards of crash protection. The Hellcat's 5-point harness system is more sophisticated than the systems used in Japanese fighters. Every detail screams one message: the pilot is valuable, more valuable than the weight savings achieved by stripping out protection. The fuel system examination begins with a simple tap on the Hellcat's wing tanks. Instead of the hollow metallic ring expected from an aluminum fuel cell, the engineers hear a dull thud. They cut into the tank carefully and discover layers of rubber-like material sandwiched between the aluminum structure. Self-sealing fuel tanks. Japanese engineers know such systems exist. They've seen references in intelligence reports, but examining one disassembled reveals the sophistication of American implementation. The self-sealing mechanism uses multiple layers of different materials. The innermost layer is a synthetic rubber compound that swells when exposed to aviation gasoline, automatically plugging small punctures. Outside that sits a layer of untreated fabric, then vulcanized rubber, then the aluminum outer skin. Engineers test the system by deliberately puncturing a sample section and pouring gasoline through it. They watch the hole seal itself in approximately 15 seconds. The implications are staggering. American pilots can take multiple hits to their fuel tanks and still make it home, while a single tracer round through a Zero's unprotected fuel tank turns the aircraft into a fireball. The weight penalty for this protection is substantial, approximately 200 pounds per aircraft for the fuel tank protection alone. Japanese designers have consistently rejected self-sealing tanks throughout the war, arguing that the weight would unacceptably degrade performance and that well-trained pilots should simply avoid getting hit. Combat results have brutally exposed the flaw in that reasoning. Zeros are burning in Pacific skies by the hundreds, and their pilots, the carefully trained veterans who were supposed to be skilled enough not to need protection, are dying with them. The engineering team compiles their initial findings after the first week of examination. The report reads like an indictment of Japanese design philosophy. The Hellcat carries protection that adds approximately 440 pounds to the aircraft's weight, 240 pounds of armor plate, 200 pounds of self-sealing fuel tank systems. That's weight Japanese designers would consider absolutely unacceptable, yet American engineers incorporated it while still producing a fighter that dominates Pacific combat. The engine removal takes 3 days. When the engineering team finally extracts the Pratt and Whitney R-2800 double wasp from the Hellcat's cowling, several engineers simply stand there staring at it. Intelligence reports have provided specifications: 2,000 horsepower from an 18-cylinder 2-row radial engine, but specifications on paper cannot convey the reality of holding components from this mechanical monster in your hands. The engine alone weighs approximately 2,360 pounds, substantially more than entire Japanese fighters weighed just a few years earlier. The disassembly process begins methodically. Engineers photograph each step, measure every component, take detailed notes on assembly techniques. The R-2800 cylinder heads come off first, revealing combustion chambers and valve arrangements that immediately spark intense discussion. The bore measures 5.75 inches, the stroke 6 inches, giving a total displacement of 2,804 cubic inches, almost 46 litres. For comparison, the Nakajima Sakae engine that powers the Zero displaces only 27.9 litres and produces roughly 1130 horsepower. The Americans are extracting almost twice the power from an engine that isn't even twice the displacement. But displacement alone doesn't explain the performance gap. As engineers examine the R-2800's internals, they discover layer after layer of sophisticated engineering solutions. The crankshaft is a massive forging, machined to tolerances that Japanese manufacturing facilities struggle to achieve consistently. The connecting rods use advanced alloys and incorporate design features that reduce stress concentrations. The pistons show evidence of sophisticated casting techniques and incorporate cooling galleries that help manage the tremendous heat generated by high compression ratios and aggressive ignition timing. The supercharger system particularly fascinates the powerplant specialists. The R-2800 employs a two-speed, two-stage supercharger that can maintain high manifold pressure across a wide range of altitudes. Japanese engines typically use simpler, less effective supercharger designs, a compromise driven partly by manufacturing limitations and partly by emphasis on low-altitude performance, where most Pacific combat occurs. The American supercharger represents a level of precision manufacturing that requires machinery and quality control processes. Japanese industry simply doesn't possess in sufficient quantity. The fuel injection system reveals another advantage. While many Japanese engines still use carburetors that can cause fuel starvation during negative G maneuvers, the R-2800 employs a sophisticated injection system that delivers consistent fuel flow regardless of aircraft attitude. This seemingly minor detail has profound combat implications. American pilots can push over into negative G dives without their engines cutting out, while Zero pilots have to roll inverted before diving to maintain positive G and keep their engines running. That half second of extra maneuvering time can mean the difference between life and death in a dogfight. Perhaps most impressive is the engine's evident reliability margin. Everything about the R-2800's construction suggests it was designed to produce 2,000 horsepower, not as a maximum emergency setting, but as a sustainable combat power output. The components are overbuilt by Japanese standards. Bearing surfaces are larger than seems strictly necessary. Cooling passages are generous. Oil circulation is robust. The Americans have apparently decided that engine reliability is worth the weight penalty of heavier construction. Japanese engines, by contrast, are often pushed to their absolute limits, with components sized to minimum acceptable tolerances to save every possible gram of weight. The result is engines that produce impressive power-to-weight ratios on paper, but suffer frequent failures in combat operations. As the engineering team catalogues their findings, they face an uncomfortable truth. Duplicating the R-2800's performance would require not just better designs, but an entire industrial infrastructure Japan doesn't have. The specialized steels, the precision machinery, the quality control systems, the manufacturing expertise, all of it would take years to develop. And Japan doesn't have years. The armament examination begins on day 10 of the detailed analysis. The Hellcat mounts 6 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing. The installation is sophisticated, with ammunition boxes that can hold up to 400 rounds per gun. The combined rate of fire from all 6 weapons exceeds 4,800 rounds per minute. Engineers calculate that in a 2-second burst, the Hellcat can deliver 160 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition onto a target. Japanese fighters typically mount 2 7.7mm machine guns and 2 20mm cannons. The total throw weight is comparable, perhaps even slightly favoring Japanese fighters in terms of shell weight. But the reliability and accuracy differences are substantial. The American 50 caliber guns are mechanically simple, extraordinarily reliable, and capable of sustained fire without jamming. The Japanese 20mm Type 99 cannon, while devastating when it hits, suffers from reliability problems and limited ammunition capacity. More importantly, the 50 caliber rounds are effective against the lightly built Zero in ways the 7.7mm rounds are not against the heavily built Hellcat. A burst of 50 caliber fire will tear through a Zero's unprotected fuel tanks, unarmored cockpit, and minimal structure with catastrophic results. That same burst against a Hellcat hits armor plate, self-sealing fuel tanks, and robust structure designed to absorb battle damage. The engineers examining the guns note another detail. The installation is clean, well-engineered, designed for easy maintenance. Ammunition feeds are reliable. Charging handles are accessible. The entire system is built for high-tempo combat operations, where armament must work perfectly every time. Japanese armament installations, while effective, often require more specialized maintenance and are more prone to combat-induced failures. By late February 1945, the structural examination is complete. Engineers have measured, weighed, and analyzed every major component of the Hellcat's airframe. The empty weight is approximately 9,200 pounds, nearly 2.5 times heavier than a Zero. But that extra weight buys survival. The fuselage uses heavier gauge aluminum with substantial internal framing. The engineers calculate that the fuselage alone could withstand structural loads that would tear a Zero apart. The wing structure is particularly revealing. The Hellcat's wings are built around a massive center section that forms a single continuous structure passing through the fuselage. This design creates an incredibly strong platform for the landing gear and provides substantial protection for the pilot and fuel tanks. Japanese fighters typically use lighter wing structures that attach to the fuselage at multiple points, an approach that saves weight but concentrates stress and provides less inherent crash protection. The Hellcat's wings also incorporate substantial leading-edge structure that can absorb combat damage without catastrophic failure. Engineers note that you could probably shoot away portions of the wing's outer panels and the aircraft would still fly. The control surfaces are hydraulically boosted and metal-covered, ensuring full control authority at all speeds. This directly addresses a weakness Japanese engineers are already aware of. The Zero's fabric-covered control surfaces become ineffective at high speeds, making rolling maneuvers above 200 knots nearly impossible. The landing gear reveals another design philosophy difference. The Hellcat's gear is massively overbuilt by Japanese standards, designed to absorb carrier landing impacts that would collapse lighter structures. The main gear struts are substantial forgings. The oleos are large and powerful. The entire system is designed for reliability and durability rather than minimum weight. Japanese carrier aircraft have lighter landing gear, adequate for their lighter aircraft, but more prone to damage from hard landings or rough field operations. By mid-March 1945, the restoration team begins work to make the captured Hellcat airworthy. The damaged engine is beyond repair, but Yokosuka has access to parts cannibalized from other captured American aircraft and from crashes. They source a replacement R-2800 from a downed B-29, though it's a slightly different model requiring modifications to the engine mount. The propeller is a bigger problem. The original is destroyed beyond repair, and finding a replacement proves nearly impossible. Engineers fabricate adapter fittings to mount a propeller from a different aircraft, accepting that performance will be compromised. The landing gear is repaired using Japanese manufacturing capabilities. The damaged struts are straightened and reinforced. New oleos are fabricated based on measurements of the originals. The work is time-consuming and requires precision machining that pushes Yokosuka's capabilities, but by early April, the Hellcat is declared ready for flight testing. Commander Takahide Ioi, one of the Navy's most experienced test pilots, is selected to fly it. Ioi has been studying the Hellcat during its restoration, sitting in the cockpit for hours, familiarizing himself with the controls, memorizing the instrument layout. The Japanese have translated the flight manual and converted American measurements to metric equivalents. Ioi knows the specifications, the performance data, the handling characteristics, as described by American pilots. But knowing and experiencing are different things. On a clear morning in mid-April 1945, Aoi climbs into the Hellcat's cockpit for the first time as pilot rather than student. Ground crew start the patched-together engine, which catches after several attempts and runs with noticeable roughness. The restoration team's work is adequate but not perfect. Aoi taxis to the runway, conscious that dozens of engineers and Navy officers are watching from the tower and flight line. He advances the throttle and feels the R-2800's power, even in its compromised state. The Hellcat accelerates down the runway with surprising eagerness. The lightweight fighter lifts off after a remarkably short ground roll. Aoi retracts the landing gear and begins climbing. For the next hour, he puts the Hellcat through a series of performance tests, carefully exploring its flight envelope. What he discovers fundamentally changes his understanding of American fighter design philosophy. The first impression is weight. Everything about the Hellcat feels heavy compared to Japanese fighters. Control forces are higher, requiring more muscle to maneuver. The aircraft doesn't respond instantly to control inputs the way a Zero does, but that heaviness brings stability. Aoi pushes the Hellcat into a dive, accelerating past 350 knots indicated airspeed. A Zero at that speed would buffet violently, with controls going mushy and unresponsive, the lightweight structure flexing under aerodynamic loads. The Hellcat just dives straight and true, controls remaining effective, the massive airframe absorbing stresses that would tear lighter aircraft apart. The test report notes that the Hellcat can dive away from virtually any situation. If an American pilot finds himself in trouble, he can simply push the nose down and accelerate to speeds where Japanese fighters cannot follow without risking structural failure. Aoi conducts turning tests at various speeds and altitudes. At low speeds, below 200 knots, he can turn the Hellcat reasonably well, though not as tightly as a Zero could manage. But above 250 knots, the Hellcat's turning radius improves dramatically, while a Zero's deteriorates as control effectiveness disappears. This explains the American tactical doctrine that Japanese pilots have been reporting. Hellcat pilots refuse to fight slow. They stay fast, using speed and vertical maneuvers to control engagement terms completely. Aoi attempts a mock dogfight against a Zero that has been positioned at altitude for comparison purposes. The results confirm what combat pilots have been reporting for 18 months. In a slow-speed turning fight, the Zero can out-turn the Hellcat. But the Hellcat pilot, in this case Aoi, simply refuses to fight that way. Using speed and vertical maneuvers, he can control the engagement completely. He climbs above the Zero using the Hellcat's superior power-to-weight ratio at higher speeds, then dives down with energy advantage. The Zero pilot tries to follow in vertical maneuvers and loses speed rapidly, becoming an easy target. The high-speed handling impresses Aoi most. Where the Zero becomes increasingly difficult to control, above 220 knots, the Hellcat remains responsive and stable up to 400 knots and beyond. The hydraulically boosted, metal-covered control surfaces maintain full authority across the entire speed range. This single characteristic explains why American pilots can engage or disengage at will. They can always accelerate to speeds where Japanese fighters cannot follow effectively. Aoi's post-flight report is detailed and sobering. He notes that the Hellcat represents a completely different answer to the question of what makes an effective fighter aircraft. Where Japanese design prioritizes maneuverability at low speeds, the Hellcat prioritizes high-speed performance and pilot protection. Where Japanese fighters achieve their capabilities through weight reduction, the Hellcat achieves its capabilities through power and robust construction. The report concludes with a statement that circulates throughout Japanese naval aviation. American pilots aren't just flying a different aircraft. They're fighting with a completely different understanding of what an aircraft should be capable of enduring. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The captured Hellcat forced Japanese engineers to confront a fundamental question they had been avoiding for years. What was a fighter aircraft supposed to do? For more than a decade, Japanese naval aviation had pursued a singular vision embodied perfectly in the Zero. A fighter should be light, maneuverable, and possess long range to support offensive operations across the vast Pacific. Everything else was secondary. Armor was dead weight that reduced performance. Heavy armament was unnecessary if you could outturn your opponent and place precise shots with lighter guns. Robust construction was wasteful when skilled craftsmen could build elegant, lightweight structures that barely exceeded minimum strength requirements. This philosophy had roots in Japan's limited industrial capacity and resource constraints, but it had been elevated to doctrine, almost to religion. The Zero's early successes had seemed to validate every assumption. In 1941 and early 1942, Zeros had carved through Allied opposition with ease. The fighter's 1,900-mile range allowed it to escort bombers on missions Allied planners thought impossible. Its maneuverability made it virtually untouchable in slow-speed dogfights. Pilots trained in the demanding art of slow-speed combat became elite warriors, their skills honed through years of practice. The Zero wasn't just an aircraft. It was the physical manifestation of Japanese martial spirit, of achieving victory through superior skill and fighting spirit rather than brute industrial force. The Hellcat represented the complete opposite philosophy. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation had designed it with one primary goal: kill enemy aircraft and bring American pilots home alive. Speed over maneuverability, firepower over finesse, protection over raw performance. The Hellcat's design specifications prioritized pilot survival so heavily that some early Navy reviewers worried it would be too heavy, too slow, too much of a truck to compete with nimble Japanese fighters. Those concerns evaporated in combat. The Hellcat achieved a kill ratio of approximately 19-1 against Japanese aircraft. 19 enemy fighters destroyed for every Hellcat lost in air combat. The numbers told a brutal story. The Zero's empty weight was approximately 3,700 pounds. The Hellcat's empty weight was 9,200 pounds, nearly 2.5 times heavier. But that extra weight bought survival. The Hellcat could absorb damage that would obliterate a Zero and still make it back to the carrier. American pilots developed tactics that leveraged their aircraft's strengths, diving attacks that used superior speed and firepower to destroy enemies before turning fights could develop. The Thatch Weave, developed by Commander John Thatch, allowed Hellcat pilots to cover each other in mutual support patterns that negated the Zero's turning advantage. Japanese tactical doctrine had assumed that individual pilot skill would overcome any material disadvantage. The best pilot in the most maneuverable aircraft would win. That was the theory. Combat results shattered it completely. An average American pilot in a Hellcat, properly trained in boom and zoom tactics, could kill an expert Japanese pilot in a Zero without ever entering a turning fight. The American pilot would dive from above, fire a burst from 650 caliber machine guns that together threw out 4,800 rounds per minute, then use his superior speed to climb away before the Zero could react. If the first pass didn't destroy the Zero, the Hellcat pilot would simply climb back up and try again. The Zero pilot, lacking the speed to pursue and lacking the climb rate to follow vertically, could only hope to evade until the Hellcat pilot made a mistake or ran out of ammunition. The range comparison revealed another philosophical divide. The Zero could fly 1,800 miles, achieved through extreme weight reduction and fuel efficiency. The Hellcat's range was roughly 1,040 miles, adequate for carrier operations but far less than the Zero's. Yet by 1944, the Zero's extraordinary range had become strategically irrelevant. Japan was fighting defensively, and American carriers had moved close enough that the Hellcat's range covered all necessary combat operations. Meanwhile, those extra miles the Zero could fly came at the cost of protection that would have saved hundreds of Japanese pilots' lives. Looking at both fighters side by side at Yokosuka, the engineering team saw two nations' competing visions of warfare. Japan had built a sword. Elegant, deadly in skilled hands, but fragile. America had built a hammer. Heavy, crude perhaps, but devastating and nearly indestructible. The sword had worked when Japan held the initiative, when experienced pilots could choose their engagements. But the war had become a grinding attrition campaign, and hammers break swords. The Zero in 1942 was arguably the world's best carrier fighter, superior in many respects to anything America fielded. But America's ability to produce thousands of Hellcats, train tens of thousands of pilots, and sustain combat operations across an ocean gave it advantages the Zero's technical excellence could not overcome. The technical reports from Yokosuka began circulating through Japanese naval aviation in late 1944, but they only confirmed what frontline pilots had been screaming about for months. Combat veterans from the Marianas, from the Philippines, from every contested island across the Pacific, had been filing after-action reports that read less like tactical assessments and more like horror stories. Now, those reports could be read alongside hard engineering data that explained exactly why Japanese pilots were dying in such appalling numbers. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's leading aces who had survived combat since the very beginning of the war, provided testimony that engineers attached to the Hellcat analysis. Sakai had been shot down and severely wounded in 1942, losing sight in his right eye, but had returned to combat duty. His August 1944 report described an engagement over Iwo Jima, where his formation of Zeros intercepted a group of Hellcats. We achieved good position above them and dove to attack. I fired at one from behind and saw strikes on his fuselage and wing. He did not catch fire. He did not fall. He simply rolled away and dove, accelerating to speeds we could not match. I had hit him perhaps 20 times with 7.7mm rounds, and he flew away as if nothing had happened. This pattern appeared in report after report. Pilots described pumping entire ammunition loads into Hellcats and watching them continue fighting. The 7.7mm machine guns that had been adequate against early war Allied aircraft were completely ineffective against the Hellcat's armor and robust construction. Even the 20mm cannon rounds, unless they achieved hits on critical unarmored components like engine cylinders or control linkages, often failed to bring Hellcats down. Meanwhile, a single burst from a Hellcat's 650 caliber guns would shred a Zero, often causing immediate catastrophic failure as the unprotected fuel tanks ignited or control surfaces were shot away. The psychological impact of this mismatch was devastating. Japanese pilots knew they were flying death traps. They knew a single hit could kill them, while their opponents seemed nearly invulnerable. Commander Tadashi Nakajima, who led fighter units through 1943 and into 1944, wrote in his private journal, later recovered and excerpted in official reports, about the collapse of pilot morale. The men know they will not return. They know our aircraft cannot protect them. They fly anyway because duty demands it, but you can see the death in their eyes before they take off. We are not fighting a war. We are flying to our executions. The tactical reports accompanying these personal testimonies painted an equally grim picture. Japanese formations had developed elaborate tactics to counter the Hellcat, but nothing worked consistently. They tried to bait American pilots into turning fights at low altitude, where the Zero's maneuverability advantage was most pronounced. Hellcat pilots simply refused to engage on those terms. They tried to achieve numerical superiority, sending large formations against smaller American groups. But the Hellcat's speed advantage meant American pilots could choose to engage or not, picking off stragglers and isolated aircraft while avoiding unfavorable situations. By late 1944, combat reports showed Japanese pilots were resorting to increasingly desperate measures. Some tried ramming attacks when ammunition ran out or when their aircraft was too damaged to continue fighting conventionally. Others attempted to use clouds and terrain to set up ambushes, hoping to get close enough that their maneuverability could compensate for the Hellcat's other advantages. None of these tactics changed the fundamental mathematics of the engagement. For every Hellcat shot down, Japanese formations were losing 10, 15, sometimes 20 aircraft. The engineering team at Yokosuka compiled these combat reports alongside their technical findings and produced a comprehensive assessment that reached the highest levels of Japanese naval command in November 1944. The report's conclusion was stark. The F6F Hellcat represents a level of aircraft design and industrial capability that Japan cannot match with available resources. Our pilots are not being defeated by superior tactics or greater skill, but by an aircraft that embodies a fundamentally superior approach to fighter design. No amount of courage or fighting spirit can overcome the material advantages American pilots possess. The report recommended immediate development of heavily armed interceptors with substantial armor protection, even at the cost of the maneuverability that Japanese doctrine had always prioritized. But by November 1944, such recommendations were academic. Japan's aviation industry was already struggling under Allied bombing campaigns, resource shortages, and the loss of experienced manufacturing workers to military service. The captured Hellcat had revealed the problem clearly, but revealing a problem and solving it were entirely different matters. The revelations from the captured Hellcat sparked frantic activity across Japan's aviation industry in late 1944. Kawanishi, Mitsubishi, and Nakajima, the major naval aircraft manufacturers, all received copies of the technical reports with urgent directives to apply the lessons learned. Engineers began drafting specifications for new fighters that would incorporate some of the Hellcat's design philosophy. On paper, these aircraft looked promising. In reality, Japan's industrial situation made most of them impossible to produce in meaningful numbers. Kawanishi's response was the N1K2J Shiden Kai, an evolution of their existing N1K design that attempted to match some of the Hellcat's capabilities. The Shiden Kai incorporated armor protection for the pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks, and 420mm cannons that could deliver devastating firepower. The prototype showed genuine promise, with speed approaching 370 miles per hour and much better high-altitude performance than the Zero. Test pilots praised its handling and combat potential, but production was a nightmare. The Shiden Kai required approximately 17,000 man-hours to build, more than twice the time needed for a Zero, and incorporated components that demanded precision manufacturing. Japan's bombed-out factories struggled to deliver consistently. Quality control became impossible, as experienced workers were drafted into military service or killed in air raids. Only about 400 were completed before war's end, far too few to impact the strategic situation. Most of those that reached combat units suffered from mechanical problems that grounded them as often as they flew. Mitsubishi attempted to develop the A7M Reppu, intended as the Zero's successor. Engineers designed it from the beginning with lessons from the Hellcat analysis: heavier structure, armor protection, self-sealing tanks, and powerful armament. The specification called for a 2,000 horsepower engine that would give it performance competitive with American fighters while retaining some of the Zero's legendary maneuverability. It looked impressive on paper. The first prototype didn't fly until October 1944, more than a year behind schedule. The engine that was supposed to power it, the Mitsubishi Mk9, was plagued with development problems: overheating, bearing failures, and inconsistent manufacturing quality meant the power plant never achieved its rated output reliably. Only 8 A7M aircraft were built before production ceased entirely. The material shortages underlying these failures were catastrophic. The self-sealing fuel tanks that had so impressed Japanese engineers required synthetic rubber compounds Japan couldn't produce in adequate quantities. Domestic rubber production had been minimal before the war, with most supplies coming from conquered territories in Southeast Asia. By 1944, American submarines had severed those supply lines almost completely. Engineers tried to develop substitute materials using natural rubber and various chemical treatments, but the results were inconsistent at best. Some batches worked adequately, others failed completely, and quality control was impossible given the chaotic state of Japanese logistics. The armor plate situation was equally desperate. The Hellcat's armor required high-quality steel alloys with specific hardness and toughness properties. Japan's steel industry, never robust by American standards, was collapsing under the weight of material shortages and Allied bombing. The steel that was available often went to more critical applications: naval construction, artillery production, tank armor. Aircraft armor was a lower priority. When armor did reach aircraft manufacturers, it was often substandard, too brittle or too soft, providing inadequate protection while still imposing weight penalties. The bauxite shortage hit particularly hard. Aluminum production depends on bauxite ore, and Japan had relied heavily on imports from the Dutch East Indies and Malaya. By mid-1944, American submarines and aircraft had made shipping these materials to Japan extremely hazardous. Bauxite deliveries dropped from over 400,000 tons in 1943 to barely 100,000 tons in 1944. Aluminum production collapsed accordingly. Aircraft manufacturers were forced to use secondary aluminum recycled from damaged aircraft and other sources, but the quality was inconsistent and supply inadequate. Even when adequate materials could be sourced, manufacturing them into aircraft proved increasingly difficult. American B-29 raids that began in earnest in late 1944 targeted industrial facilities systematically. The Musashino aircraft engine plant, one of Nakajima's primary facilities, was hit repeatedly. Production rates collapsed. Skilled workers were being drafted into military service or killed in bombing raids, replaced by inexperienced laborers, including schoolchildren and elderly workers, who couldn't maintain the quality standards precision aircraft manufacturing demanded. A Zero that would have taken 10,000 man-hours to build in 1942 now required 15,000 or more as worker efficiency declined and quality control necessitated more rework. The captured Hellcat had revealed another problem that no amount of engineering could solve: the quality gap in pilot training. American pilots arriving in the Pacific by 1944 had typically received over 300 hours of flight training before seeing combat. They had practiced gunnery until they could hit targets consistently, learned formation flying until it was second nature, and trained in tactics specifically designed to leverage their aircraft's strengths. Japanese pilot training had been compressed to barely 100 hours by 1944, with fuel shortages forcing even that reduced schedule to be cut further. New pilots were arriving at combat units barely able to fly their aircraft, let alone fight in them effectively. The engineering teams understood the cruel irony. They had captured an example of America's finest fighter, analyzed it thoroughly, understood its advantages completely, and still couldn't close the gap. The Hellcat wasn't just a better aircraft. It was the product of an industrial system Japan couldn't replicate, built from materials Japan couldn't access, designed for manufacturing processes Japan couldn't implement, flown by pilots trained to standards Japan couldn't afford. Every lesson learned from the captured fighter just highlighted another insurmountable disadvantage. The strategic implications of the Hellcat analysis reached far beyond tactical aviation by early 1945. What the captured fighter revealed wasn't just an aircraft performance gap, it was a window into the fundamental imbalance between American and Japanese war-making capacity. Combined fleet staff officers who read the technical reports understood that if America could build fighters this sophisticated in the quantities combat reports suggested, then Japan had already lost the industrial war, regardless of how many battles remained to be fought. The production numbers were staggering. Grumman had delivered the first production Hellcats to the Navy in January 1943. By the end of that year, over 2,500 had rolled off the assembly lines. Throughout 1944, production averaged nearly 500 aircraft per month. By war's end, Grumman would build over 12,000 Hellcats from a single factory complex, more fighters than Japan's entire aircraft industry produced across all types in the final 2 years of the war. And the Hellcat was just one American fighter type among many. The Navy also operated the Vought F-4U Corsair in large numbers, while the Army Air Forces deployed P-38 Lightnings, P-47 Thunderbolts, and P-51 Mustangs by the thousands. Japanese intelligence officers compiled estimates of American aircraft production that seemed impossible until multiple sources confirmed them. America was producing over 90,000 aircraft annually by 1944. Transport planes, bombers, fighters, trainers, everything aviation warfare required. Japan's peak production year was 1944, with approximately 28,000 aircraft of all types, and that production was already collapsing under bombing campaigns and material shortages. The Americans were building aircraft more than 3 times faster than Japan could, and American aircraft were individually superior to their Japanese counterparts across nearly every performance metric. The Hellcat analysis also revealed the depth of America's technological and industrial integration. Every sophisticated component in the fighter, the R-2800 engine, the propeller, the hydraulic systems, the radios, the weapons, the instruments, came from specialized manufacturers who supplied them in quantity to multiple aircraft programs. Pratt and Whitney engines powered dozens of different aircraft types. Hamilton Standard propellers equipped fighters, bombers, and transport planes. The industrial ecosystem that supported the Hellcat's production was vast, resilient, and growing stronger, even as Japan's manufacturing base deteriorated. This realization forced a fundamental reassessment of Japanese strategy at the highest levels. The entire war plan had rested on assumptions that now appeared tragically flawed. Japanese planners had believed that early victories would give them time to consolidate conquests and build defensive positions that would make any American counteroffensive too costly to sustain. They had assumed that after suffering heavy losses, America would negotiate a settlement that left Japan controlling most of its conquered territories. The Hellcat and the industrial might it represented demolished those assumptions completely. American losses in the Marianas, in the Philippines, throughout the island-hopping campaign hadn't slowed the offensive at all, because America could replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them. For every carrier aircraft Japan destroyed, 3 more appeared to take its place. For every pilot killed, 2 newly trained aviators arrived from the vast American training pipeline. Japan, meanwhile, was losing pilots and aircraft it couldn't replace. Each engagement, even those where Japanese forces inflicted significant American casualties, left Japan proportionally weaker because the attrition rates were unsustainable. By March 1945, the strategic calculus was brutally simple. Japan had approximately 5,000 aircraft of all types remaining, most of them obsolete, many grounded for lack of fuel or spare parts. American forces approaching Okinawa could call on thousands of carrier aircraft, plus land-based air power from captured island bases. The ratio wasn't just unfavorable, it was apocalyptic. The captured Hellcat had helped Japanese planners understand exactly why they were losing, but understanding the problem didn't provide solutions. Some problems, once you understand them fully, reveal themselves to be unsolvable with available resources. The captured Hellcat sat in a hangar at Yokosuka through the final months of the war, a silent witness to Japan's collapse. The summer of 1945, the engineers who had so carefully documented every aspect of the fighter had moved on to more desperate work, analyzing wreckage from B-29 raids, attempting to develop countermeasures for the firebombing campaign that was burning Japanese cities to ash. The technical reports they had compiled gathered dust as strategic realities overtook technical analysis. Understanding why you were losing didn't matter much when the war was already lost. American forces discovered the Hellcat when they occupied Yokosuka Naval Arsenal in August 1945, after Japan's surrender. The fighter sat among dozens of other captured and indigenous Japanese aircraft, all tagged with Japanese technical documentation. American intelligence officers found it somewhat surreal. Here was one of their own fighters, painstakingly disassembled and analyzed by the enemy, its every component photographed and measured. The Japanese technical drawings were remarkably thorough, showing an understanding of the Hellcat's design that rivaled Grumman's own engineering documentation. The legacy of that captured fighter extends far beyond its role in World War II. It represents a case study in how wars are won and lost at the intersection of design philosophy, industrial capacity, and strategic vision. The Hellcat succeeded not because it was the most elegant fighter or the most maneuverable or the fastest. It succeeded because Grumman and the United States Navy understood that winning an air war required aircraft that could be built in quantity, that could protect their pilots, that could absorb punishment and keep fighting, and that could be maintained under combat conditions by crews who weren't specialized craftsmen. The Japanese engineers who examined the captured Hellcat recognized superior solutions when they saw them, but recognition alone couldn't bridge the gap between understanding and implementation. The Zero had been designed for a short, decisive war, where Japan's limited industrial capacity could produce enough fighters to achieve air superiority during a brief window. The Hellcat was designed for a long attritional struggle, where industrial might and pilot survivability would ultimately determine the victor. Both aircraft served their nation's strategic visions perfectly. The tragedy for Japan was that their strategic vision had been wrong from the beginning. There is a broader lesson here about how technological competition works in wartime. The capture and analysis of enemy equipment is standard intelligence practice, and Japan's engineers did everything right. They were thorough, professional, and honest in their assessments. But intelligence only matters if you can act on it, and by 1944, Japan couldn't act on what the Hellcat revealed. The material shortages, industrial bottlenecks, and resource constraints that made Japan unable to match American fighters weren't going to be solved by better engineering. They were fundamental limitations of Japan's industrial economy, and no amount of captured enemy equipment could change that. When historians examine the Pacific Air War, the captured Hellcat at Yokosuka serves as a perfect symbol of the conflict's essential nature. Here was Japan's best effort at understanding American technology, carried out competently by skilled engineers who recognized quality when they saw it. And none of it mattered because the war had stopped being about individual aircraft quality and had become about industrial systems, resource access, and the ability to sustain losses while maintaining offensive pressure. Japan could capture and analyze every American weapon system and still couldn't overcome the fundamental asymmetry in industrial capacity. The fighter was eventually shipped back to the United States, where it spent years in storage before being restored. The Japanese technical reports remain in archives today, hundreds of pages of careful analysis, professional engineering assessment, and increasingly desperate recommendations. They tell the story of an enemy who understood exactly why they were losing, but lacked the means to change the outcome. In war, sometimes understanding the problem is the cruelest knowledge of all, because it forces you to watch defeat approaching with perfect clarity and no ability to prevent it. That captured Hellcat at Yokosuka taught Japan that lesson more thoroughly than any battle ever could. The morning after Japan's surrender, engineers at Yokosuka walked past the captured Hellcat one final time. It sat there in the hangar, American markings now visible beneath the Japanese paint that had been hastily applied for test flights. The aircraft that had revealed so many truths, that had exposed so many inadequacies, that had demonstrated so clearly the gap between what Japan needed and what Japan could produce. One engineer, his name lost to history, reportedly placed his hand on the Hellcat's wing and said to a colleague, "We knew what we were facing. We measured it. We tested it. We understood it completely. And it made no difference at all." That single sentence captures the essence of Japan's experience with the captured Hellcat. Perfect intelligence, thorough analysis, professional engineering assessment, all rendered meaningless by industrial realities that no amount of understanding could overcome. The Hellcat kill ratio of 19-1 stands as one of the most lopsided combat records in aviation history. But that ratio doesn't tell the complete story. Many Japanese aircraft the Hellcat destroyed were flown by poorly trained pilots in obsolete fighters, flying missions that were suicidal from the start. By late 1944, Japanese aviation was in such desperate straits that even perfect fighters flown by expert pilots might not have changed outcomes significantly. Commander Charles August, the pilot whose forced landing had given Japan this intelligence windfall, survived his captivity and returned home after the war. He rarely spoke about his time as a prisoner, but in a 1978 interview he mentioned learning years later that his aircraft had been captured and thoroughly analyzed by Japanese engineers. "I'm told they learned a great deal from it," he said. "I'm told they understood exactly what they were up against. I wonder if that knowledge made their situation better or worse. Knowing you're beaten but having to keep fighting anyway, that might be harder than not knowing at all." The captured Hellcat's story illustrates a fundamental truth about modern warfare. Technology matters, but the industrial capacity to produce that technology in quantity matters more. Skilled pilots matter, but the training infrastructure to produce skilled pilots in large numbers matters more. Understanding your enemy's capabilities matters, but only if you possess the resources to counter those capabilities. Japan's engineers did everything possible with the captured Hellcat. They analyzed it thoroughly, documented it meticulously, learned its secrets completely, and none of it changed the war's outcome because the industrial gap was simply too large to bridge. The Pacific Air War was decided not in the skies over contested islands, but in the factories of Detroit and Long Island and Los Angeles, where American industrial might produce aircraft faster than Japan could destroy them. The captured Hellcat at Yokosuka revealed that truth with crystalline clarity to Japanese engineers, who had the technical expertise to understand what they were seeing, but lacked the industrial resources to do anything about it. In the end, the most sophisticated intelligence in the world cannot overcome a 10-to-1 disadvantage in production capacity, a 3-to-1 advantage in pilot training time, and a fundamental mismatch in industrial philosophy. The Hellcat represented more than American engineering skill. It represented American industrial confidence, the certainty that pilot lives were worth protecting even at the cost of performance, that reliability mattered more than absolute capability, that wars were won by the side that could sustain operations over years rather than months. Japanese engineers recognized these truths when they examined the captured fighter. Their report said so explicitly, but recognition came too late, when Japan's industrial situation had already deteriorated beyond recovery, when the war's outcome was already determined by forces far beyond what any single captured aircraft could influence. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.